In this video, I am going to cover for you when you're looking to buy a business, the things you ought to be thinking about, whether you're buying the company shares or you're buying the assets. And I'll also talk you through what the buyer prefers and what the seller prefers. And this is one of the first things you ought to be thinking about before you buy a business. In this new series, I'll be talking about buying businesses, so we'll be covering things like buying either the assets or the shares, talking about the due diligence process, talking about the different forms of funding that are available to you, and other things that you need to be aware of when buying a business. But the one main question that people usually have is, shall I buy the assets of a company or shall I buy the shares of a company or business? And I mean, that depends on the business that you're buying, i.e. the actual structure, because obviously if you're buying a business from somebody who's a sole trader, you can't buy the shares because they own the business in their own name. But for this particular video and the topic of conversation, we're going to assume that an individual has the option of either buying the shares of a limited company or they can buy the assets. Now, generally speaking, most buyers tend to favor, not all the time, but they tend to favor buying the assets. And how that usually works is a company will have a certain number of assets. The buyer then buys those assets and the funds go to the company, and then the person selling then obviously has to pay the tax through the company on the sale of those assets. And then if they want to take the money out, they then have to pay extra personal tax. The good thing for the seller is it's less onerous, there's less due diligence that needs to take place, because obviously if you're buying the shares of a company, you're then taking over all the previous liabilities, so you've got to have detailed due diligence, you've got to have warranties that you take out because you're obviously ultimately responsible for the company. The challenge we have from the seller's point of view is, if they sell the assets, they can't claim entrepreneur's relief, whereas if they sell the shares, they can claim entrepreneur's relief as long as they meet the rules. So sellers are usually more keen to sell via shares as opposed to assets. Now, of course, they could claim entrepreneur's relief if they cease trading and they've sold the assets and then do a voluntary liquidation, but that's a topic for a different day. So usually, if you are looking to sell, if you end up selling the assets, you'll probably have more people who are interested in buying, because as I've said, buyers prefer buying the assets, so the seller has a bit more leverage, and the sale usually takes place quicker because there's less due diligence to do. So if you're really looking to sell your business quickly, then selling the assets will make that happen quicker than selling the shares. In terms of from the buyer's point of view, as I've said, they're going to be more keen to buy the assets, and you've then got to work out what those assets are worth, and then there's possibly complicated tax calculations for you in terms of the depreciation stroke capital allowances that you've claimed on those assets, and the net book value is a profit or loss on disposal. But again, I don't need to cover that because we're not talking about tax alone on this particular video. And then if the buyer is also buying the assets plus some goodwill, they then want to work out what form of goodwill that is. Again, that's slightly complicated outside the scope of this particular video, so those are some of the things that you may have to think about. Then there's VAT implications depending on if you're taking over stock and if you're VAT registered, so that's something that you'll have to bear in mind. And then obviously when assets are being transferred, depending on the type of assets they are, if there's property involved or other assets which have loans on them, that can again be time consuming, so that's something that you'll have to bear in mind. But generally speaking, people who are buying businesses, they prefer to buy the assets. Not all the time, but generally they do. Sellers prefer to sell the shares in a company. Now the other option, of course, is shares, and as I've said, if people meet the rules, then they want to claim entrepreneur's relief, then they're keen to sell the shares because they're only paying 10% tax on the first £1 million per person. If you are buying the shares, you'll have to do a financial due diligence and obviously a legal due diligence, and then other checks which I will cover on the video that I make on due diligence, but that's just to point that out to you. But the seller will prefer selling the shares. It's gonna take a long time, in my experience. The sale of shares takes a much longer, or takes a lot longer than the sale of assets. So be ready for that. It's going to cost you more in legal fees, it's going to cost you more in accounting fees, purely because of the due diligence. If there's property involved, that's going to cost you even more, especially from a legal point of view, depending on whether you're buying the property or if you're leasing the property, then you'll need a lease. So that's something that you'll obviously need to bear in mind. So the costs are going to rack up, and then obviously you've got all the issues of warranties. But depending on the type of business you're buying, as a buyer, sometimes buying the shares might work well for you anyway, and there are different reasons for that. For one, could be license and regulatory. So if let's say you're buying a children's home, and rather you don't have a license, and this is the first one that you're buying, then because you're buying the shares of a company, the company's already registered, you just need to change the ownership with the regulator as opposed to applying for a new license. That's just one example. If you're buying a children's day nursery, it's the same thing again with Ofsted. If you're buying an existing nursery, you need to make them aware that the registered person has changed. That's quicker than trying to get a new license with Ofsted, and there are obviously other industry specific examples of that. So those, I've kind of kept it very brief and simple for you to think about whether you want to buy the shares or the assets. My preference is to buy the assets where we can. I find that works better, but again, it's a negotiation and depends on the circumstances. Alongside that, then you'll have to think about QP and employees contracts. Again, a good solicitor will be able to help you with that, alongside obviously a financial due diligence of any particular liabilities, pensions and all that kind of stuff. So that's something that you'll need to be aware of, because it's quite important. If you're buying the shares, you'll have to pay stamp duty on the value of the shares at 0.5%. Again, depends on how much you're paying for the shares, but that's something that you need to bear in mind. And these are all the things you need to be thinking about when you're negotiating with a seller, so you can factor things in. So if you're purely just buying the shares, again, ballpark, in terms of legal fees, it's going to rack up an extra £5,000 to £7,000. Just ballpark, again, depends on the size of the business, how much extra work needs doing. It's always difficult to obviously give fees. And then for your financial due diligence, again, you're looking at, again, depending on which firm you use, minimum for a basic DD, you're looking at £5,000, going all the way up to £25,000–30,000. And if you're doing a multi-million pound deal, you're looking at 50 grand plus in terms of DD fees just for the financial side, and the same for the legal. But if you're buying a small business for, say, a couple hundred grand, then it's gonna, and you're buying the shares, you're gonna rack up an extra 5 grand for the legal fees and an extra, I'd say, 7.5 to 10 grand for the financial due diligence. So bear that in mind when you're negotiating with the seller, and you'll have different things you want, the seller will have different things they want. It's just coming to some kind of a compromise to make sure things work for you. But as we go through some of the other videos, and I point out other things, you'll find areas and avenues and angles where you can negotiate by giving in certain places and taking in certain places, so overall you get the best deal possible and it becomes a win-win situation. I hope you found that useful. If you did, click the like button. If you want more videos like this, press subscribe so we automatically notify you of the videos. And if you've got any questions, post them in the comments below and I'll happily answer every single one for you.